So we decided for feature, process, and resource, we decided to go with resource. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen.
Yep.
And I'm going to quickly go to the Rejuvi 45, the Rejuvi Venture site, rejuviventure.com. In the upper right-hand corner, you'll see a login button. And I am going to put my PIN in. And I'm going to log into the platform. I'm logging into the platform as an administrator. And so as I log into the platform, I am logging into a platform from a company called BlackRock Steel. And because, again, we are talking about feature, process, or resource, we are going straight to resources today. We will be conducting these demos, these tours 3 times a month. We'll be posting them, and some of them we'll talk about, the site overall. We've got actually some of those documented, but today's not the day for that. Today, and when we think about feature, process, or resource, we're going to resources. That means we're going into resources to go. And because we're asking people to think about succession planning and leadership development differently, we're talking about leadership practitioners. So we're going to go to the trusted partner folder, and there we're going to see lots of tools and options for a leadership practitioner. We are going to look at this folder called Blueprints, Roadmaps, and Guides. Blueprints is our word for how do you do leadership development differently for leaders, teams, and businesses. Roadmaps is all about how do you get a big job to be done inside of your organization that needs leadership, like manage a transformation. A guide is how do you use leadership predictively and prescriptively through Rejuvi Predict and Guide. So we're going to go into that folder today, and we're going to look at this resource called Rejuvi Implementation Blueprints. We're going to click Preview, and it's going to open up the way that all resources to go do at Rejuvi. We're not going to spend too much time on the front end of this particular document, but what we want to start to demo for people is a resource here, a resource to help you think about succession planning a little bit differently. And so what that means is you need a blueprint for a business-based solution. When you go here, we have blueprints to think about building a new sense of strategic intent, or we have a blueprint for trying to understand pushing past engagement and getting into the alignment body of work inside your organization as well. And then we have a blueprint called a leadership bench critical path. And another way to think about that is, how do I start to think differently about succession planning? And you're going to come to your first, this is actually the first time that we've recorded a session on a Rejuvi blueprint. This is what you'll see is a little picture here, which is kind of like a spirit picture that helps you to start to say, how do we think about this particular blueprint? And then you'll see boxes in the middle. We see that as the critical path, the chunks that you absolutely have to include inside of whatever blueprint you're on. And then you'll see lots of little pictures. These are resources that you'll call up to help execute against that critical path. And then always you'll see a timeline at the bottom left, which is how much time will it take you to actually do this? So this is called a leadership bench critical path. And, Vid, what this does is it helps you to start thinking about, if I wanted to consider, what I wanted to do, I wanted to pull up the hand-drawn 9 box. I'm like, I don't have to do that because there's one there.
This one there, yeah.
Yeah, this is really about starting to help your organization think differently about succession planning. And to think differently about succession planning, you have to start this first piece, this first component of the critical path is all about talk through the 9 box. And you see a little picture of that sitting right there. Because at the end of the day, what this leadership bench critical path is designed to do is help you to start thinking is that performance and potential should actually be these 2 words, capability and capacity. You want to understand in a very in a very good way, what does leadership excellence capacity look like in a person, and what does the capacity of leadership look like inside of the organization, right? It has to start right there. And then what I want to do is draw everyone's attention to, this, it's just too much detail to go through in general today, but it's going to finish up with reporting growth. And you're going to see 2 little pictures here. Because if you can start to think about your X and your Y axis differently inside of the succession planning process, what you are now able to do is both at the individual level and the business level is to produce reports that help you to understand how much leader capability do we have that exists inside of leader X, leader Y, leader Z. And I'm going to point you to this little picture here called the Think to Drive tour. And what that does is it's like a heat map that helps you to understand that leadership capability inside of leader X, leader Y, leader Z. And it's going to give you some understanding of their, what I call their C capability, what Rejuvi calls their C capability, or their IQ, their ideation quotient. It's going to give you a heat map for their no capability, or their EQ component. That means environmental quotient. And then it's going to give you a score for their do capability, which is their AQ or their agility quotient, right? And you can run these reports for Think to Drive capability, strength of a leader at both a leader level that helps you to evaluate how ready is this person to take on a next assignment, but you can also run them at a group level. For example, to say, how much capability do we have inside of, our entire sales leadership organization, right? That's where you're headed with the leadership bench critical path, right?
Yep, absolutely. And I think the other piece that's super important, and you said that even as you were, as you were talking through this, is the idea that you want to be replacing performance and potential with capacity and capability,
Yes,
right? And the idea is that then you said at the end, you said you want to report on the growth. And so those two are obviously connected notions. That's why they're on this critical path, is that you need to be thinking more in terms of everybody who's in your leadership, who's on your or should be on your leadership bench. What's their current capability and capacity? And there'll be different degrees of that, right, based on their development. The idea then becomes is you identify the folks that you really need to bring the capability capacity up, and you do that via those aids, like you were pointing to the Think to Drive tour, the Build to Sustain tours. Highly technical terms for someone who's not familiar with the Rejuvi method, but the fact of the matter is that simply understand that that's a landscape or a heat map view of your capability and capacity for the entire bench
that's
and
right.
each leader on the bench. And the journey is now, or the beauty of it is now you identify, what are the reds that are critical that need to turn to yellows for the organization? What are the yellows that are critical that need to turn to the greens for the organization? And that's how you report growth. So it's a continuous learning, teaching, training, and developing process. And that's why it's a critical path. It's not a event. It's not episodic. It's something that's continuous. I just wanted to reinforce that notion about when we said it's a resource that gets continually implemented inside the organization.
I agree. And I also like that you went, I just kind of did an overview of the Think to Drive tour, and I like how you also mentioned the Build to Sustain tour, because these 2 things are different. The Think to Drive tour is going to be your access that talks about the leader capability, the things that make your leaders either individually or collectively strong. And you need to know where you're at. You need your heat map for that, for continual growth. But you also need a heat map for what we call the build to sustain tour, because that helps you to understand your leadership capacity. This speaks in language of the business. How much strategic intent capacity do we have? How much business unit intelligence capacity do we have? How much midterm targeting of the right work do we have? And how much implementation, how much bite off this much, this next period capacity do we have? So you also need that heat map, because that answers the question called how much leadership capacity do we have? That's at the business level. Think to drive tour is how much do you have at the leader level, right? Those are two very different things. Both inform leadership excellence.
Yep, exactly. Yep.
Yeah. So one resource that we wanted to demo today was the critical path for how to start to think about a leadership bench, or how to start to think seriously about addressing some of the problems inside of succession planning. And again, we're talking just very lightly about kind of what needs to happen here, because if you look at the time lapse, these are things that organizations are going to work on for 12 months, right? Because you're going to be watching leadership capability and capacity being built over a year until your next succession planning cycle. What I want to do now is that the second problem that we talked about with the leadership, the succession planning 9 box, wasn't just the fact that we have really weak ways of consistently understanding performance and potential, and it needs to shift to capability and capacity. But the other problem that we have is that succession planning and putting people in a box and giving them an IDP, for many, is what their leadership development process actually is. And that needs to be fixed too. And so if I go back upstream in this particular resource, which is called the implementation blueprints, we're now really taking a look at an intervention for the leader, not for the business. And there are 3 roadmaps, 3 blueprints that we have built. One for how do I build a coaching cohort for my leaders inside of my business. Another one is how do I rethink some of the training that we want to offer for our business. And the third is how do I redo or rethink my leadership development. And that's the one that we wanted to highlight today for launch boxes to go. And here you go again. If you're brand new to Rejuvi implementation blueprints, you're going to start to see the same things. You're going to see the spirit picture. And in the case of a new modern leadership development critical path for leadership development that replaces an IDP and a list of courses, this is like thinking, we've got a university picture here. This is like helping a company rebuild their, welcome to my company's leadership university. This is the way that we lead inside of our organization. It's a way to start thinking about rebuilding those exciting programs that organizations, find critical to their business. This one, a little bit different than the succession planning, the leadership bench critical path. This one has 5. And I think what's really important here, just a couple of things that I want to point out again, is that this one, if you take a look at it, starts really early out as you're thinking about who's coming into your leadership university anew, who's coming into your brand new programming. And that means that there's all these colors, right? There's all of these different types of levels of leaders that are coming in. You may have team leaders coming in, which is for Rejuvi, that's Rejuvi team, the color is blue. You may have service leaders coming in, that's purple. You may have sales leaders coming in, that's red. You may have senior leaders coming in, that's butterscotch. But one of the most important things about this particular piece is that when you build your new leadership development programming, it can be for leaders at all levels, because the research of what leadership excellence looks like for each of these levels at a capability level, the leader think to drive, or at a capacity level, the business built to sustain, looks different. And so it's really important that we understand that this particular critical path starts out with those things. And I think then for me, what's most important is that we take a look at how does this actually start to finish up. And fast forward, however long you choose to build your leadership university, what's happening is that you're conducting a reassessment. Because what you need to do in your modern leadership development university, or your modern leadership programming that now exists for all levels of leaders inside your organization, is you should help them to reassess. Where did they start the program at? What was their baseline? You want to then, you do this work with them, you want to measure again at the end, and you want to understand that delta. And then what you're actually able to do now is you're able to take that delta and you're able to translate it to business outcomes. That's a brand new leadership development, modern leadership development critical path that should replace taking all of these people who've just been put in, the middle of the 9 box where great leadership goes to die.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think the key thing again to reinforce the notion that it's all about working towards paying attention to measuring and reporting growth.
Mhm.
And it's not just simply growth of the activity and the improvements, but it's also growth as that leader capacity capability improves, as that leader cohort capability capacity improves, what's happening to the business at large? Is the
Mhm.
business also experiencing or receiving the growth that the leader and the cohorts are receiving? That's the key point here. Like to your point about, but what you just said about the 9 boxes, again, not to belabor the point. The point is should be it's not just about identifying your high potentials, it's identifying if as your high potentials are growing, is the business receiving the growth that one would
Mhm.
expect? More importantly, as your leadership bench grows, is your business receiving the growth that it deserves? So that's the whole idea behind these critical paths
Yep,
as well.
I couldn't agree more. One last thing, and then we'll wrap up for launch boxes to go. For those of you who are new to this resource, again, this is implementation blueprints. It's easy to find inside of the Rejuvi platform. Not only does it give you the critical path, but you'll see all these little mini pictures that Vid and I have been talking about. These are like resources within the resource. So you follow the critical path. You take note of the time frame that it usually takes an organization to deliver this, like what kind of time span and how many hours need to be dropped in terms of development over that time span. But all of these are mini resources where you're leveraging processes like data collection or analytics and reporting, or you're going into resources to go to call up these resources, and you're just mixing and matching them in order to execute against this critical path.
Mhm.
So, that is what we call the Rejuvi implementation blueprints. I'm going to kind of put this back together for people. Rejuvi implementation blueprints are a resource that you find inside of resources to go. And resources to go is one of the main features of the actual platform. And so today, as we think about the subject called launch boxes to go, the message is an organization needs a succession plan. The X and the Y axis of the 9 box now have changed from performance and potential to capability and capacity. All of those things can be managed through a process that you can actually find inside of a Rejuvi implementation blueprint. The second message is that, unless it's someone that is going to take, that is ready to take over a key role, like, a chief sales officer or a chief marketing officer, that everyone else doesn't need to be put in a box. They need leadership development. And leadership development is not completion of an IDP. It's not, getting a list of courseware and putting it into the IDP. It's actually having access to real leadership development that builds their capability and their capacity at the right level from entry to exit inside of the organization. And that means that organizations can now rethink and rebuild all of their leadership programming inside of an organization with one easy platform.